I'm very happy to introduce to you today the historian and historical archaeologist Nancy Seasholes. As you all know, Ms. Seasholes is the recent author of Gaining Ground, A History of Landmaking in Boston, published by MIT Press. And after her talk today, Ms. Seasholes will be signing copies of her book in the first floor ballroom. I have had the pleasure of knowing Ms. Seasholes for over 10 years. Her research interest in Boston landmaking has made her a frequent researcher in the Athenaeum's Prints and Photographs department, a department which, as many of you may know, has an extensive collection of historic and contemporary views of Boston and New England. As the associate curator in the Athenaeum's print room, I, in turn, have often called upon Ms. Seasholes' expertise in landmaking to date various historic Boston views in our collection. Ms. Seasholes' knowledge of her field is truly amazing, as is her generosity in sharing it with others. Ms. Seasholes received an A.B. in history from Radcliffe College and a Master of Arts and Teaching from the Harvard Graduate School of Education. In addition, she earned a master's and a PhD in archaeology from Boston University, and she is currently on the faculty of the Harvard Extension School and an independent scholar. You will be pleased to know that Ms. Seasholes will be teaching a course based on her book, Gaining Ground, during the spring semester at the Harvard Extension School. Ms. Seasholes has been working full-time on Gaining Ground since 1992, and during that time she miraculously found time to also write numerous journal articles, archaeological reports, and to be a contributing author to that wonderful book, Mapping Boston, also published by MIT Press. Her new book proves to be every bit as intriguing for all of us who are fascinated with Boston's extremely unique topographical history. So please join me in welcoming Ms. Nancy Seasholes.
Thanks, Katharina. Can we turn off the lights? We forgot to talk about that. So I am here today, as Katharina said, to talk about my new book, Gaining Ground, A History of Landmaking in Boston. You may wonder what this term landmaking means, and I think that perhaps, oh dear, this is the one I've been having troubles with. Here we go. No? Let's take it. Come on. Oh. There we go. This map, which comes from the book Mapping Boston, which, as Katharina told you, I am one of the authors of, I think will help us understand what I mean by landmaking. You can't hear? Okay. Monica? Okay. I have a pinned on mic, and it's supposed to have been turned on. Sorry about that. I think they'll get it fixed in a minute. Can you hear now? Okay. And forgive the voice. Obviously, I have a cold. This map shows the land area of Boston in 1630 when it was first established in dark green. All of this around it is land that has been added to Boston by filling in tidal flats. That is, areas covered with water at high tide, but exposed mudflats at low tide. These different colors represent different periods, different time periods in which the filling was done. Some people call this process landfill or land filling. But actually, well, first of all, landfills to me sound like garbage dumps. But on top of that, I think that land filling is an oxymoron when it is applied to Boston, because what was being filled here was water, not land. Other people refer to this as land reclamation. But that, I think, is also a misnomer when it is applied to Boston. Land reclamation, to me, implies diking, pumping, and draining to reclaim land from the sea, as was done, for example, in the Netherlands. And that is not how land was made in Boston. In Boston, land was made by a very simple technique. A structure, in the 19th century, usually a stone seawall, was built around the outer perimeter of an area to be filled, and then fill was simply dumped inside that retaining structure until the level of fill was above the level of high tide. That's all there was to it. Now, the structures the fill retaining structures changed over time, the types of fill changed over time, and almost needless to say, so did the technology by which the fill was both excavated and deposited. But this is the basic way that land was made in Boston from the 17th century right up to the present. I got interested. I just wanted to go back to this term landmaking. So I call it landmaking because that's really what was going on. They were making land by filling in water. I should point out that the term landmaking is not in the dictionary, but I didn't coin it either. It's a term used by archaeologists, and one that I find very useful. Actually, for mapping Boston, MIT Press insisted that I divide it into 2 words. But as you can see, they have relented for my book. And I'm actually hoping that it's going to make it into the next edition of Merriam-Webster. But since an edition has just come out, we're going to have to wait 10 years to see what happens. I first got interested in this topic of all the filling in Boston when I was working as an historical archaeologist. That is, somebody who works on sites for which there are written records as well as archaeological evidence. For most of the 1980s and the early 1990s, I worked for various archaeological consulting firms in New England. The work was basically in the environmental review process. As you probably know, for any federally, or in this state, state-funded project that involves what archaeologists refer to as subsurface disturbance, but in plain English means digging, there has to be an archaeological component of the environmental impact statement. These projects were generally big public works projects, highway widenings, court-ordered sewage treatment plants, gas pipelines, and, of course, the big dig. My job was to do the historical research to figure out where there would be sites before we ever went out and did any digging. And one of my basic sources was historical maps. In fact, that's how I got interested in historical maps in the first place. But every time I had a job in Boston, it was like reinventing the wheel. I always had to figure out whether the project was on original land or on made land, and if it was on made land, then I had to figure out when it was filled and how and with what. There was exactly one modern book on the subject. This is Walter Muir Whitehill's Boston, A Topographical History. And as you know, Whitehill was a former director of this institution. I want you to note, by the way, given what I'm about to say, that I actually did used to use my Whitehill. You can see the cover has come off the book, and in fact, it's very well worn. Well, as I used Whitehill, I discovered that actually it has a lot of inadequacies. In the first place, as I'm sure you know, Whitehill does not talk about the filling in many parts of Boston, particularly Charlestown, East Boston, South Boston, and Dorchester. Then, even for areas where he does discuss filling, he often focuses as much or more on architectural development as he does on topographical. And finally, I found that Whitehill has a lot of inaccuracies. I think this is because he based his work heavily on antiquarian sources, and as I discovered, the key to understanding all the filling in Boston is primary sources. So I began to accumulate my own information on the subject, eventually writing a dissertation, and now this book. When I began my work, I had some really very simple research questions. I wanted to know where there was fill in Boston, when these areas had been filled, why, by whom, how, and with what. And somewhat to my surprise, I was able to find the answers. I don't think I would have been so surprised had I known then what I know now about 19th century Boston public records, because, as I said, they were really the key to the problem. I used personal papers of people who were involved in these projects, and I used the records of corporations that did some of the filling. And I just have to give you one sidelight here about some records that I used that are here at the Athenaeum. The corporation that filled the area that's now the Bay State Road area near BU was called the Riverbank Improvement Company. It was formed by two Adams brothers, Charles Francis Adams Jr. and John Quincy Adams II. And so when I went to look for the papers of this corporation, I went to the Massachusetts Historical Society because, as you know, they have the Adams papers. And I did find something for the Riverbank Improvement Company, but there was clearly a book that was missing. So I began looking around for it, and guess where I found it? Right here. So then the question became, well, how did part of the Adams papers get to the Athenaeum? Well, we finally figured out that what must have happened is that Whitehill had borrowed it from the Mass Historical Society and never returned it. Well, the librarians know this. It is considered part of this collection now, not the Mass Historicals. Other records that were very useful were records of the city and of state commissions that conducted some of the largest projects. These state commissions were required to file annual reports, and reading these annual reports is almost like reading a to-be-continued serial. They would talk about one problem one year, then the next year you'd see what they'd done about it, and so on, and so on, and so on. They were really a wonderful source of information. Interestingly enough, it was much harder to find out about filling that was done in the 20th century. Many of these state commissions stopped filing annual reports, and some of the filling was done by large utilities, like what used to be Boston Gas or Boston Edison. And so in those cases, I often ended up talking to people in their public information departments. But from wherever the information came, I was able to piece together the whole story. So what did I find out? Now this is the one. There we go. It's a little recalcitrant. Well, first of all, I found out how much made land there is in Boston. But before I tell you the figure, I just have to explain a few qualifications of my study. First of all, I only looked at made land in Boston itself. Now, we know that there's lots of made land in Cambridge and also in other areas surrounding Boston. But my study covers only Boston. It does not cover Cambridge or Everett, Chelsea, Winthrop, Quincy, or other abutting areas. And then I also looked only at the Boston mainland. We know that some of the islands, as shown here, Spectacle Island, have a lot of made land, but I did not include those. And then even in the area of mainland Boston, in which I also included Charlestown and East Boston, there were some limits. My study only extends up the Charles River as far as the BU Bridge. That would be about here. Is this in focus? Okay, not to me. I'm glad it is to you. Now, I know that there's made land in both the Allston and Brighton sections of Boston along the Charles, but that I did not study it. It is not included in the total I'm about to tell you. And similarly, I only looked at filling in Dorchester on the Neponset as far as the Neponset Bridge, right here. And again, there is fill on the Neponset in Dorchester, but that's not included in the study. So, with these qualifications, how much made land is there in Boston? Well, according to a computer mapping program, about 5,250 acres. Is that the largest amount of made land of any city in North America? I wish I knew. One of the things that came out loud and clear from my study is that there have been very few studies of land making anywhere else. And this is really curious because land making is a very common phenomenon. Almost any major city on a coast, a major river, or a lake has made land along its waterfront. And yet, as I said, this has been very little studied. I did find a 1973 master's thesis about San Francisco, which approached the subject just about the way I did for Boston. It looked at different areas, talking about why they'd been filled and how, but did not include acreages. If I had to guess, I would probably say Boston has the largest amount of made land of any city in North America, and San Francisco may be second, although at a recent lecture at MIT, someone suggested that maybe Mexico City is the second largest. As you probably know, Mexico City is built on land that was made by filling in a large lake. So, we need more work on this. Well, having discovered how much made land there is in Boston, then it's possible to say what proportion of Boston is made land, something that people are always interested in. In this area of mainland Boston, there are about 30,000 acres. So in other words, the 5,250 acres of made land means that about 1/6 of Boston is made land. However, the total area of mainland Boston includes lots of inland areas like West Roxbury, Jamaica Plain, Roslindale, and Roxbury that have no made land at all. And clearly the proportion is going to be much higher in areas along the shore. And I think actually this is easier to see on this Mapping Boston map. Around the original Boston Peninsula, for example, starting at the line of East Berkeley, West 4th Street, and going around to the line of Beacon Street, which I chose because it excludes Back Bay. That's a different problem. The original peninsula has been almost doubled by landmaking. Similarly, Charlestown, which was once a peninsula, has been about doubled by landmaking. Don't be misled by all this area here, which is in Cambridge. East Boston, which was originally on 5 islands, the largest 2 of which were Noddles and Breeds, and they were quite large, but then has this huge amount of made land that's now the airport, has been increased in size about 2.5 times. And South Boston, which was also once a peninsula, but has a large amount of made land on its north shore. This was made by filling in the South Boston Flats, and is where the South Boston waterfront area is now. And also a lot on the south shore, where what was Columbus and is now Moakley Park is located, has been increased in size about 3 times. So, as I said, it depends on where you're looking at when you want to talk about the proportion of made land in Boston. Looking at the Mapping Boston map, we can also see which are the largest land-making projects. Everybody always thinks it's Back Bay, but when you look at this map, I think it's pretty clear that it's really the airport that it was the largest land-making project. The airport has about 1,630 acres of made land, of which 215 are actually in Winthrop. So they didn't even count in that total that I gave you before. Part of these flats right here belong to Winthrop. The second largest project was the filling of the South Boston Flats to make the area now the South Boston waterfront. That created about 650 acres of new land. And then finally Back Bay, which everybody thinks is the largest, was actually third largest. The eastern part of Back Bay, which is the part that was filled by the big project that began in the mid-1850s that many people know about, was originally about 570 acres. But by the time that project began in the mid-1850s, about 170 acres had been filled around the edges, meaning that that big project made about 400 acres of new land. So this is one thing that my study has found, is trying to shed some light on questions that people are always asking and have been only speculative up till now. Obviously, another thing I found out is how all of this filling was done. And I thought I would just tell you very briefly about one project, which is all the filling that was done for the airport. This is a detail from an 1896 chart which shows East Boston, Noddles Island, right here, and then this large area of flats, tidal flats, where the airport is today. This was called the East Boston Flats. All during the 19th century, Bostonians were very concerned about losing shipping to New York. Actually, the basic problem is that New England has no bulk export product. So as a port, Boston has always been dependent on imports. But in the late 19th century, their explanation was something else. They thought that the reason Boston was losing shipping to New York was because Boston didn't have what they called modern port facilities, which they defined as publicly owned piers served by railroads. So beginning in the late 1880s, there were a number of proposals for a large port development on the East Boston Flats. This is the plan of one that was made in 1910. They intended to fill here above Governor's Island. It's filling in this area right here, is what this shows. Then they were going to build these large piers, and I hope you can read, it says the center area was to be for tracks and warehouses. The plan that was actually adopted was this one in 1915. 2 huge arms of fill were going to be extended out from East Boston covering Governor's Island, that is all the way out here, and reaching almost out to Apple Island here. Here's Apple Island. All of this was to be filled. Note that these arms of fill were going to cover over Wood Island, which had just recently been made a park. The two big arms of fill were going to be separated by a central basin, and it is the L-shaped configuration of this basin that determines the configuration of the fill in this area in the 1920s and 30s, as we're about to see. This project got underway in 1915. This is a detail from a 1916 chart. They built wood bulkheads extending out from the tip of the Jeffreys Point part of East Boston. By this time, they'd given up stone seawalls and were using wood bulkheads instead. And then dredges that were working in the harbor, dredging out the main shipping channels, came and dumped the dredgings behind the bulkheads to make new land. They also began filling this area here, which was called the Governor's Island Channel. This is when there were extra dredgings. They dumped them in this called the dumping ground, so that the dredges wouldn't have to take them out to sea, which was both expensive and wasteful. By 1921, this is the extent that had been filled, and they were beginning to extend the bulkhead out towards Governor's Island and also on the north side of this for that big port development, according to the plan that I showed you. But then events took an unexpected turn. After World War I, Boston was interested in having what they called a landing field. We'd call it an airport now. Recreational flyers wanted this. Boston wanted to have an airmail service, and the military was interested in it. So in 1919, the City Planning Board made a study of 15 sites in the Boston area for a possible landing field, and they finally decided that the perfect location would be what is now Carson Beach in South Boston. Well, it met their specs at the time. It was near to the city and easily accessible, and the specs at that time only called for 1,800-foot runways, which is a far cry from the 10,000-foot runways at the airport today. However, in 1919, that area in South Boston was slated to be a public park. So they dropped it, and in fact, they dropped the whole project for 2 years. In 1921, they took it up again, and that time they came up with two locations for a landing field. One was an area that was being filled here in South Boston to connect Castle Island to the mainland, and the other was this area that was being filled on the East Boston Flats for a port development. The South Boston site was slated for industrial development, so almost by default, the East Boston site became the Boston's new airport. Excuse me. They built a T-shaped runway right at the upper extent of the fill in 1923, and the airport opened in September 1923. Looking in the opposite direction, this is a 1924 aerial. You can see they've already paved in between the arms of the T's, and you can also see the planes here lined up right in front of the hangars. But the main point of showing this slide is to show how the bulkheads were extending out towards Governor's Island. This is for that port development, and particularly the L-shaped configuration of the bulkheads right here, which was to form the central basin of the port development. Just to remind you what that port development was going to be, this is a 1927 map. Here's the T-shaped runway on fill, and this area labeled C was also filled. D, E, and F hadn't been filled yet. You can see the bulkheads here, just as you can here, extending out towards Governor's Island, and particularly the L-shaped configuration of the bulkheads right there, forming the central basin of the port development. It's also visible here on a 1930 aerial. Here is the one arm extending out towards Governor's Island. This is what was going to be the central basin in the port development. And the other arm of fill, that this one, was going to be extended, was going to be made and extended out here. This is the extent of the fill of in the airport in 1937, as you can see. Finally, in 1939, the state gave up the idea that this made land was going to be a port development and decided that it would be Boston's permanent airport. Then, during World War II, when they needed much more landing space, the legislature authorized a huge expansion of the airport. It was authorized in December 1943, and in 1944 they began pumping up material from the bottom of the harbor here and depositing it on the flats hydraulically. That means pumping it through a big pipe mixed with water, vastly increasing the size of the airport. Most of this fill here was done between 1944 and 1946. And actually, I think you can see a little more clearly on this 1952 aerial just how much land was made at the airport. As you can see, it covered over Governor's Island, it covered Apples Island, and it extended almost up to the Bayswater section of East Boston and almost over to Winthrop. The 1943 Act that had authorized the expansion of the airport had also changed its name to the General Edward L. Logan Airport, soon to be International Airport. Well, who was General Edward L. Logan? It turns out that General Edward L. Logan was a South Boston resident. He was in the Army. He had served in the Spanish-American War. He'd commanded an infantry division an infantry regiment in the Yankee Division during World War I, and he had become a lieutenant general in the Massachusetts National Guard in 1928. Actually, for most of his life, from 1914 until he died in 1939, he was a municipal judge in South Boston. As far as we know, he never went up in an airplane. But his wife was interested in aviation, and in 1943, when they were trying to find somebody to name the airport after, she suggested it be named after her husband as a memorial to him. You know, it'd be really interesting to know who in higher places Mrs. Logan knew, but she prevailed, and that is why a major American airport is named for a virtual unknown who had no connection to aviation. The filling that was done in the 40s still preserved Wood Island Park, although it was very impacted, but it succumbed to a runway extension in the 1960s over great protests from East Boston residents. And then in the early 1970s, the Bird Island flats were filled in here, creating the present configuration of the airport. This is the 1995 aerial. So this is the type of thing that my book traces, trying to trace the filling step by step and why it happened. In this case, I certainly learned things I didn't know before. I knew that the fill at the airport was L-shaped in configuration, but I had no idea why until I found out about this port development. Well, in addition to finding out about a lot of projects, I suppose like all research into Boston history, I also uncovered some wonderful scandals. The most outrageous of which concerned the filling of this area of the South End here, bounded by Malden Street, Harrison Ave, Mass Ave, and a line behind Albany Street. I should just mention that this map comes from the book. The book is organized geographically. There's a separate chapter on each area of Boston, each section of the city that has been filled, and each chapter begins with a map, many of them like this, that show the original, the 1630 shoreline, plotted on the current street maps, so that you can see what is fill and what is not. This is a photo taken a couple of years ago at the corner of Malden and Albany Streets, just to show you what this area is like today. It's mostly commercial, except down at this end where it's the Boston Medical Center. This is a detail of the South End from an 1852 map of Boston. In the 1840s, when the famine Irish were pouring into Boston, the city's response was to try to keep the Yankee residents within the city. The Yankees at that time were beginning to move to nearby suburbs like Roxbury Highlands. The city wanted the Yankees to remain both as voters to counteract the Irish and also as taxpayers. And their means of trying to encourage the Yankees to remain within the city was to develop some upper middle class residential areas, of which the South End was one and Back Bay was another. So in the 1840s, the city began laying out streets, planting trees, and building sewers in the South End. The squares for which the South End is so famous, this is a Union Park Square up here, were actually not laid out until the early 1850s. Well, as part of this project, the city decided that it was going to do something about the sewage in the South End. This is an 1845 plan of South Bay, which was the body of water that fronted on the South End. All during the 19th century, or at least until the early 1880s, when Boston's first main sewage system opened, the sewers simply discharged raw sewage at the nearest shoreline. From there, it was supposed to be taken away by the ebb tide. Actually, a lot of it was brought back by the incoming tide and sat festering on the flats at low tide. Knowing that this was a problem and wanting this to become a nice residential area, the city decided in the 1840s that what they would do would be to fill in the flats fronting the South End and extend the sewers out to deeper water in South Bay, where presumably the sewage would be carried off more readily. So beginning in 1845, they began a big project to fill in this area, bounded by Malden Street, Harrison Ave, Mass Ave, and this line behind Albany Street, the same area you can see here on the 1852 map. This was called the South Bay Lands Project, and as we can see on this 1852 map, by 1852, this much of it had been filled in. The area shown in gray is what had been filled above the level of the high tide. Just note that on both of these 1852 maps, there's a railroad track going across from the old Colony line in South Boston across South Bay to the area of the South Bay lands being filled. I just wanted to point this out to show that fill was brought by rail on the South Bay Lands Project. Many people think the first time was the Back Bay Project, but that's not true. And in fact, the South Bay Lands Project wasn't even the first one. Fill had been first hauled by rail to fill South Cove in the 1830s. But back to the South Bay Lands Project, and I promised you a scandal. To do all of this filling, the city had contracted with a man named William Evans, whom I'm sure they were very sorry they ever heard of. William Evans was without a doubt the most litigious person I have ever come across. No matter what kind of a contract the city made with him, he always sued the city for damages under it. And then in order to settle these suits for damages on one contract, the city always felt forced to make another contract with him to settle the claims on the first one. And this became a vicious circle. It went on, and things came to a real head in August of 1858 over the construction of some wharves along South Bay. The city had decided that they wanted these wharves built so that they could rent them out and defray the cost of the filling. Well, in August 1858, the city commission supervising this wrote William Evans a letter saying they didn't think these wharves were well built. They seemed to be collapsing just under their own weight, even without anything on them. 2 days later, Evans wrote back and said it wasn't true. He thought the wharves had been built according to city specs, but then he said if the city wanted them built in a more stronger way, it could pay for it. Well, 1 week later, in a storm, one wharf collapsed and another was badly damaged. Then there was yet more negotiation. Finally, Evans won the contract to repair his own deficient work. This is only the tip of the iceberg of the William Evans story. You really have to read it to appreciate it. It's all in this chapter about South Bay. Another big scandal had to do with the construction of Atlantic Avenue, which, as you know, is the street that used to run across right next to the water. It was rerouted in 1976 in order to form Waterfront Park. And I just wanted to point out that this is a 1992 bird's eye that I use a lot in lectures because it just makes it easier for people to figure out where I'm talking about. We're talking about the central waterfront area. Here's Quincy Market, the Custom House Tower, Long Wharf, the aquarium in Harbor Towers. So this is, as I said, so Atlantic Avenue used to run along right next to the water, meaning that this walk in front of Waterfront Park now is where Atlantic Avenue went. In fact, you can see a bit of the seawall that was built for the construction of Atlantic Avenue. Atlantic Avenue was built between 1869 and 1872 by building it right across the wharves and the docks in this central waterfront area. Note that the term dock, at least until this century, meant the water into which ships sailed, not the structures at which they tied up. Just to turn this, I just wanted to point out that the dirt for this came from Fort Hill, which is where International Place is now. This is that same map turned so that it's aligned. Whoops. Similarly to this detail from an 1870 bird's eye. Here you can see Atlantic Avenue being built across the dock between T Wharf and Commercial Wharf, right across here. As I said, the dirt came from Fort Hill, which was being cut down at the time. This is a photo taken about 1870 of the cutting down of Fort Hill, which was a very high hill where, as I said, International Place is now. Part of the dirt was cut down with what they called steam excavators, we would say a steam shovel, and loaded into these hand-operated railroad cars, which ran on movable wooden tracks and taken down to the docks that way. But a lot of it was carried in horse-drawn tip carts and taken down to the docks. Here is a photo taken about 1871 of cutting down of Fort Hill. And again, you can see this large hill and the horse-drawn tip carts to haul the dirt down to the docks. Well, the scandal. The scandal erupted in 1871 when it turned out that some of the contractors who were ferrying the dirt down to the docks with horse-drawn tip carts were selling it to ships' captains for use as ballast in ships. In other words, these contractors were being paid twice, once by the city for taking the dirt down to the docks, and once by the ship captains for the same dirt for use as ballast. The investigation into this scandal was complicated by the fact that one of these contractors was not only a member of the city council, but he was also on the committee to investigate the city engineer's office, which was also implicated in the scandal. Well, they had extensive hearings, which they published very conveniently, and they were a wonderful source of information about the Fort Hill project. The Fort Hill project not only involved building Atlantic Avenue across the docks, but as you can see on this 1866 proposal for it, it also involved cutting through the buildings that were then on the wharves. And there is actually a little evidence of one of these cuts through a building for Atlantic Avenue still remaining today, and that is at Commercial Wharf. Here is the two parts of Commercial Wharf that were cut apart for the building of Atlantic Avenue. Remember, I said that Atlantic Avenue is where the walk now goes in front of Waterfront Park. This is the other section of Commercial Wharf, the extension of this, which forms, as you know, one side of the basin in front of Waterfront Park. Let's see. After Atlantic Avenue was built across the wharves and docks, then the docks were filled in. And the reason that the grain exchange building is triangular is because it was built on the made land that was created by filling in this triangular dock right here. There's also a lot of other evidence of earlier shorelines and landmaking projects in Boston, if you know where to look for it. So I thought I would show you some of them. This is the western end of the Central Wharf buildings. Central Wharf was a very long wharf that was built between 1815 and 1816 between Long Wharf and India Wharf. So in other words, this is this end of the buildings, so the water once ran along here. Just to show you where this is, here's that bird's eye again. The remaining parts of the Central Wharf buildings are right here. Here's the Custom House Tower, and here's the Grain Exchange building, if that helps you get oriented. Then, moving around the corner from the Central Wharf building, we come to the Custom House itself. As you probably know, it was originally built as a two-story Greek Revival building with just a dome on top. The tower was added between 1913 and 1915 as Boston's first skyscraper. But as I said, we're really looking at evidence of earlier shorelines. You can see how close the water used to come to the Custom House. Here's the bowsprit of a ship that we're looking at this side of the Custom House right here. Here is on an 1838 map. So we're looking at this dock right here, right in front of the Custom House. Then, looking at this same view today, or rather a few years ago when there was a lot of big construction on State Street, you can see that there's a building that has been constructed in that dock. That's the State Street block. Just to show you where it is on the bird's eye, it's right there in front of the Custom House. So again, this also used to be right next to the water. And of course, these buildings that you know very well were once on the water's edge. This is an 1827 drawing of what we now call Quincy Market, North Market, and South Market. And as you can see, the water used to go right there. In fact, this sailboat is where Marketplace Center is today. This area had been filled for the market buildings in the 1820s. And here you can see again on a detail from an 1826 map how the market buildings were right next to the water at one point. As part of this project to fill in and create land for the market buildings, they decided to extend two streets over the docks and wharves in the north end in this direction. And you can see them finished here on this detail from an 1829 map. It was what is now Commercial Street and Fulton Street in the north end. In other words, this building that it's on Commercial Street in the north end was also once at the water's edge. It was right, it is the building that is right there, but at one time this was the edge of the water. Then when I wanted to show you where this building is on the bird's eye. We're talking about the building that's right here. Then, when this more filling was done in this area in the 1850s, this is the 1829 map again. This is a detail from an 1857 map. They filled in front of Commercial Street and built this building that you are familiar with on the made land. This is the Mercantile Wharf building. So the point is the shoreline was right here at one point. This is the building, the Mercantile Wharf building is right next to Waterfront Park. So again, this is evidence of an earlier shoreline. And then there are these two classic examples taken 100 years apart from the same place, 1894, 1994. The vantage point, the Harvard or the Mass Ave Bridge. And you can actually see that the buildings are the same in both. This building here is obviously this one here. This with the oriel window here is obviously that building right there. The point of this is to show you that the seawall that is currently next to Storrow Drive was once at the river's edge. In other words, Storrow Drive and actually all of the esplanade is on made land. And then finally, there is this example from the south end. These two houses, which are on West Brookline Street, are 4 feet difference in height. I think you can see there perhaps on their doorsteps. I know it's a little dark. I'm going to see if I can explain to you why two houses next to each other on West Brookline Street came out being 4 feet difference in height. West Brookline Street is right here. The lower house is on this side of the dotted line, and the higher house is on that side of the dotted line. What does the dotted line represent? It represents the line that divided the flats that were owned by the city in Back Bay and those that were owned by the Boston Water Power Company. The flats that were owned by the city were filled in the 1830s. This is a detail from an 1852 map that you can probably tell is pieced together from various photos, which is why there's a strip missing there, sorry. But this shows the area that was filled by the city in the 1830s. Here's West Brookline Street. At the time that the city did this filling in the 1830s, what was called the receiving basin in the Back Bay was kept, the water there was kept at an abnormally low level. In Boston, there's a 10.2-foot difference between mean low water and mean high water. But in order to enable the mills that were located here on Gravelly Point, which is basically the Mass Ave area today, to operate at all times, including at high tide, they kept the water in the receiving basin only 3 feet above mean low water. That is well below the level of high tide. That meant that when the city filled this in the 1830s, they didn't have to fill it above the level of the high tide, and yet the sewers would still be able to drain. I hope this is clear because it's actually significant in terms of some current problems. Then, when and you can see that here on this same 1852 map we saw before. Here's the line dividing the city's flats from the Boston Water Power Company's flats, and here's West Brookline Street. You can see that the streets were actually filled above the level of the high tide, but the place where that house is looks as if it's just a marsh, and that is because it wasn't filled above the level of the high tide. It didn't need to be. However, then, when the Boston Water Power Company filled its part, beginning in 1855, it was required by the state to fill it, the house lots had to be at least 12 feet above mean low water. So, in other words, above the high tide. So that is why in some places, and here is West Brookline Street right there, in some places there are houses that are on the land that was filled by the city in the 1830s, which was filled to about 7 to 9 feet above mean low water, right next to houses that were filled by the Boston Water Power Company that were filled to at least 12 feet above mean low water. Here's the opposite side of West Brookline Street. And again, you can see the difference in height. This is the one on the land filled by the city in the 1830s. This is on land filled by the Boston Water Power Company in the 1850s. The fact that some of the south end was not filled above the high tide has led to some really serious problems in the south end. You may be aware of the terrible flooding that was there, the sewage backing up into people's houses until very recently. The problem seems to be under control right now, but as the engineer who was in charge of the project said to me, you never say that any engineering problem is permanently solved, but they think they have a handle on it at the moment. There's some other problems that are caused by fill in Boston. Come on. There we go. One that's very serious right now is what I call the falling groundwater rotting foundation piles problem. What is on the left is a detail from an 1870 bird's eye. We're looking at Back Bay. Here's Arlington Street with the Arlington Street Church, Berkeley Street, First and Second Church, and Church of the Covenant, and Clarendon Street. But the point of showing you this is for what's here in the foreground, which looks like a lot of sticks on the ground, but are actually wood pilings. As you probably know, buildings built in the 19th century on fill in Boston are all supported by wood pilings that are driven down through the fill to support the foundations of the buildings. You can see that in the drawing on the right, which actually comes from a Globe article this last summer on the problem. Here are the wood pilings supporting the foundation of this 19th century building. Now, when they did this in the 19th century, they cut off the tops of the pilings well below the groundwater level. As you probably know, wood is preserved almost indefinitely if it's kept always submerged in water. The problem is, in the 20th century, the groundwater level has been dropping, leaving the tops of the pilings exposed to air. And when wet wood is exposed to air, it is subject to rot. And that's what you see in this enlargement right here. The pilings have been rotting, leaving the foundation unsupported. This is a drawing from a 1985 Globe article on the problem that shows you what the fix is. The fix is very expensive. One has to excavate by hand underneath these buildings in the foundation, cut off the rotted foundation pile below the level of rot, replace the rotted piling with a steel piling enclosed in concrete, and then, of course, refill it. The current estimate is that it costs about $250,000 to $300,000 per house to fix this problem, and it is a problem that seems to be spreading. This is a map from last year's Globe article on the subject. In the 1930s, the city installed observation wells to monitor the groundwater levels, and the wells in which the groundwater level is low are shown here with black dots. So you can see that there is low groundwater in Back Bay, in the South End. It's been a very serious problem on the Beacon Hill Flat, along Hemingway Street, in the Fens area, in Chinatown, and somebody told me recently that there's a building on Fulton Street in the North End that is also having problems with rotting foundation piles. This problem has not been solved. It is one that the city is trying to deal with right now. Another problem caused by fill is that of the possible increased damage in case of an earthquake. You may not think of Boston as being in an earthquake zone, but it actually is. It's in a moderate earthquake zone. The problem is that fill is less consolidated than original land. And so in case of an earthquake, fill is less stable, and the shaking from an earthquake would be what geologists say amplified by an earthquake. That's what this map here on the right shows. It's computer generated, and you can probably see it's a little skewed. Here's the original Boston Peninsula. These letters, by the way, just simply indicate different areas of Boston: South End, Back Bay, East Boston, etc. But the red shading shows areas that would have amplified damage in the case of an earthquake. And as you can see, there's a very great correlation with areas of fill in Boston. Another problem with earthquakes is that fill can liquefy. The particles of fill are actually suspended in water, and when they are shaken really violently, like in an earthquake, the whole thing can turn to sort of a liquid mass. That actually happened in Massachusetts, in Scituate, in the last big earthquake we had, which was 1755. It happened in the Kobe earthquake in Japan, and it is a real hazard. So, to move on now, finally, to the end of this, I've turned the Mapping Boston map on its side so that it's aligned a little more similarly to this 1983 aerial. But you can see here is where the original Boston Peninsula was, connected to the mainland only by a narrow neck along Washington Street. South Boston, you can again, I think, see the original South Boston Peninsula here in the street plan, and this huge amount of fill for the South Boston waterfront. East Boston, again, you can see the original Noddle's Island and the immense amount of fill at the airport. And note that Back Bay actually extended inland almost all the way to Washington Street. In other words, all of this was Back Bay, not just the part we call Back Bay now. In other words, Back Bay included parts of the South End, the St. Botolph district, and the Prudential area. There is a lot of made land in Boston. So that really brings me to the end of what I wanted to say. I just wanted to make a comment about the bird's eye on the cover of the book. Some people have asked about it. It's an 1866 bird's eye, and what are we looking at? Well, in the foreground is Back Bay. Here's the public garden and the common, and we're looking across to South Boston and Castle Island before all of this filling was done. In other words, we're looking across approximately at this cut right here. I think, given the time, I'm going to be willing to, or I'd be glad to answer any questions while I'm signing books. And I also just wanted to mention again that I'm giving this course based on the book at the Extension School in the spring semester. They will be illustrated slide lectures. Each class will be on a different section of Boston. If you're interested, I suggest you get in touch with the Extension School, and I have the information on a poster next to where I'm going to be signing books. So, thank you very much.